22 players stood waiting in the middle of a World Cup match. The referee was ready. The ball was ready. Tens of thousands of supporters inside the stadium were ready. Millions more were watching from around the world. And yet nobody moved. Not because of an injury, not because of the weather, not because of a security issue. The match had stopped for something else. A commercial break somewhere. A television network was still running advertisements, and until those advertisements ended, football would have to wait. That moment lasted only a few minutes. Most viewers probably forgot about it before the final whistle. But it revealed something much bigger than a delayed restart. For more than a century, football followed a simple principle. Once the game started, it belonged to the players. No scheduled timeouts, no television stoppages, no interruptions designed around advertising schedules. That uninterrupted flow became one of the defining features of the sport. It separated football from almost every other major competition on Earth, yet only days into the World Cup, fans began noticing something different. Matches were stopping on schedule. Broadcasters were cutting away. Commercials were appearing in the middle of live play. And suddenly, a simple hydration break became the center of a much bigger debate. Because once fans discovered what was really happening during those stoppages, many started asking the same question. Is FIFA protecting players? Or is football being redesigned around television? Officially, the explanation sounded perfectly reasonable. FIFA described these mandatory stoppages as a player welfare measure. Hydration, recovery, protection. On the surface, almost nobody objected. Football can be exhausting. Summer conditions can be dangerous. Keeping players safe is not controversial, but then supporters started noticing something strange. The breaks weren't appearing only during extreme heat. They weren't limited to difficult conditions. They weren't even tied to weather at all, because traditionally, water breaks appeared when conditions demanded them. These breaks appeared because the clock demanded them. And that distinction changed the entire conversation. If the stoppage was truly about player protection, why did it seem disconnected from the conditions it was supposedly designed to address? Because football fans can tolerate inconvenience when it serves a clear purpose. What they struggle to accept is inconvenience that appears designed for something else entirely. Whenever something in professional sports stops making sense, people eventually follow the money. And in this case, the trail wasn't difficult to find because these breaks created something incredibly valuable. Not goals, not better football, advertising, inventory, new commercial space inserted directly into the middle of live World Cup matches. For decades, football's uninterrupted flow limited how many commercials broadcasters could show during a game. That limitation was part of the sport's identity. Suddenly, every World Cup match contained scheduled pauses. Every pause created an opportunity. Every opportunity carried value. And that's where the skepticism really began. Because supporters generally accept change when it improves the game. But many fans struggle to identify how mandatory stoppages improved football itself. The hydration break was no longer being viewed as a health measure. It was being viewed as a business model, and what happened next made that perception even harder to ignore. Then came the detail that transformed a debate into a controversy. Not every broadcaster used the breaks in the same way. Other broadcasters made a different choice. Full-screen commercials, sponsor messages, advertising blocks inserted directly into the middle of World Cup coverage. That difference mattered because it exposed something important. The interruption itself may have been mandatory. The commercials were not. And once fans realized that, the entire argument changed. The debate was no longer about hydration. It was no longer about player welfare. It became a debate about priorities. If some broadcasters could keep showing football, why were others choosing advertisements? If the rule existed primarily for player protection, why did it fit so perfectly into a television business model? Those questions spread quickly across social media, football podcasts, and sports radio. And for the first time, many supporters began wondering whether they were witnessing the future of football. A future built less around the match itself and more around the industries surrounding it. Football supporters are not always united. They argue about clubs, players, managers, owners, referees, and almost everything else the sport produces. But every so often, something happens that brings very different groups of fans together. This was one of those moments because the criticism wasn't really about a 3-minute stoppage, it was about what that stoppage represented. To many supporters, the hydration break felt less like a standalone policy and more like a test. And that fear matters because football has always sold itself differently. The sport's identity was built on continuous action, one flowing narrative, no manufactured pauses, no artificial resets. Fans weren't reacting to 3 minutes. They were reacting to the possibility that football's identity was slowly being rewritten. And once supporters begin believing the sport is changing for the wrong reasons, resistance becomes almost inevitable. But then something happened that made the controversy much bigger. People stopped talking about hydration breaks altogether. Instead, they started connecting the policy to everything else surrounding the tournament. Ticket prices, empty seat debates, travel complications, questions about transparency, broadcast controversies. Individually, none of those issues were large enough to define a World Cup. Major tournaments always face criticism. Problems happen, mistakes happen, but when enough controversies appear at the same time, people begin searching for a common explanation. And for many critics, that explanation was becoming increasingly obvious. Commercialization, the hydration break, suddenly stopped looking like an isolated decision. It started looking like another piece of a much larger pattern. A tournament increasingly shaped by television contracts, sponsorship obligations, and commercial priorities. Whether that perception was entirely fair almost didn't matter anymore, because perception drives public opinion, and public opinion drives narratives. The more FIFA defended the breaks as player protection, the more some supporters interpreted them as evidence of something else. A shift in priorities, a shift in values, a shift away from the football itself. And once a narrative like that takes hold, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. And that's where this story becomes much bigger than one tournament. Because football is always changing, new technologies arrive, new formats emerge, new business opportunities appear. Change itself is not the problem. The real question is who benefits from that change. But many supporters struggle to identify what problem these mandatory stoppages actually solve. If the primary winners are broadcasters, sponsors, and television partners, then skepticism becomes unavoidable. The concern isn't that football will transform overnight. The concern is that change rarely arrives all at once. It arrives gradually. One adjustment becomes another. One new commercial opportunity becomes several more. And before anyone notices, the sport begins feeling different. That is why this debate has resonated so strongly. Not because of 3 minutes, because of what those 3 minutes might represent. A preview of how football could look 10 years from now, and for many supporters, that future feels deeply uncomfortable. Maybe FIFA genuinely believes these breaks help players. In certain conditions, they probably do. Extreme heat is real, the player welfare matters. No serious football fan would argue otherwise. But that isn't why this debate refuses to disappear. The debate continues because millions of supporters believe they are watching something much larger unfold. They are watching football navigate an increasingly difficult balance between sport and business, between tradition and revenue, between the game itself and the industries built around it. The hydration break lasts only a few minutes, yet it has sparked a conversation about the future direction of the world's most popular sport. And that is why the reaction has been so powerful, not because supporters hate water breaks and because they fear what comes after them. But every so often, a seemingly small rule exposes a much bigger question. Who is the modern World Cup really being built for? The players, the supporters, or the people purchasing the advertising space in between? Because if football's greatest strength was always its uninterrupted flow, then perhaps the most important question facing the sport today is not how long the breaks last, it's who benefits when the game stops. And that question may outlive this tournament long after the final whistle has blown.